The Lone Ranger. What's up, guys? Been a while since I made a video, I know. Coming at you from a slightly higher vantage point because I figured, why not boost up the chair a little bit. I think this works a little better. So, I saw a movie last week, day it came out, Lone Ranger. Not because I was super excited about this movie. In fact, I had a pretty good idea that this movie was going to suck. And basically, my dad bought tickets weeks in advance. And even after the movie got shitty reviews, we were like, well, we'll get out of the sun, and it can't be completely awful. And in its defense, it's not completely awful. But it's definitely not worth seeing in the theaters, and clearly movie-going audiences agree with me, because this movie is setting up to be one of the biggest box office bombs of all time. So, let's talk about it. The Lone Ranger tells the story of a man becoming a vigilante, seeking out justice against criminals. And it's about him, how he comes to be. It's his origin story. It's about the Indian who partners up with him, and they, go off and fight crime together in the Old West. It's based off a very old and once upon a time popular character, and this is how he got his start. So, The Lone Ranger, directed by Gore Verbinski, starring Johnny Depp, produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, so we all know where this is going. This is very much Pirates of the Caribbean, but instead of water and boats, we have sand and horses and trains. So, with that in mind, obviously, when I saw the trailers for this movie, I thought it had potential, but then I was like, how it would be so easy for this movie to suck, because you look at the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. The first one, they were humble. They had something to prove. They were trying a genre that hadn't worked for the last 20 years, possibly longer. The pirate genre was pretty much dead at that point. They didn't have an unlimited budget. They were working with some actors and actresses who weren't 100% proven commodities. And out of that humbleness emerged a really great summer action movie that I enjoyed a lot. But then you see what they did with the franchise. It became overindulgent, overpacked, just over silly, really. I mean, it just got too crazy. It got obsessed with itself rather than trying to do more interesting things. It became obsessed with just trying to repeat the same notes from the first movie. They got a giant budget. They got freedom to do whatever the hell they wanted. And in my opinion, they made two pretty bad movies. And I haven't seen the fourth one yet, and I don't really care to. So you look at that and you go, hopefully they'll have learned something. Even though they made a shit ton of money from the last three movies, maybe they learned something. They didn't. This movie is probably worse than either of the Pirates of the Caribbean sequels I've seen. And in many cases for the same reasons. So, let's start with the beginning of the movie, because my first problem with this movie is you know what? I'm going to be nice. I'm going to say two things about this movie that I did like, and then we get to the bad stuff. Number one, the plot is simple, and it serves its purpose. It's not great, it might not even be good, but it's fine. It serves its purpose. It made me think of the plot in the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, where things were simple and streamlined, and yeah, it was fast-paced, and it moved quickly, but it was fairly straightforward, and it worked. And then in the sequels, they got a little crazy, and it seems like in this one, they kind of learned from that at least a little bit, and they made this plot very simple. And I appreciated that. I think it worked. Number two, the chemistry between Armie Hammer, who plays the Lone Ranger, and Johnny Depp, who plays Tonto, is pretty good. Makes me wish they made a better movie. That's all I have in terms of good things for this movie. So, as for the bad, let's start at the beginning of this film. This movie has a framing device, and this isn't a spoiler. This is going to be a spoiler-free review, but the framing device comes into play the moment the movie starts, so I'm not spoiling anything. A framing device, which is basically the movie is actually taking place in San Francisco in the 1930s, and there's this display of Wild West things that this boy is walking through and checking out. It's got a fake buffalo, some fake Indians and stuff, and then Tonto jumps out of one of the displays or whatever and starts walking and talking around, and obviously by this point Tonto's like 90 years old or something, and basically the movie is him telling the story of the Lone Ranger to this kid. And it's just really, really silly. And I know the movies like this are going to be a little silly, but this is this just, I think it goes too far. This is something that is so obviously aimed at a very young child who's going to be amused by something like a 90-year-old Tonto in a massive amount of makeup walking around grumbling to himself and doing quirky things. And it just sets the whole movie up to be silly, and many parts of the movie don't follow that tone. But beyond that, this movie's 2.5 hours long. It doesn't need to be that long. If they cut out the framing device completely, this movie saves 20 minutes. Maybe even more. But there are 5 or 6 scenes where that framing device comes back into focus, and we go back and we look at the 90-year-old Tonto, and it's like, why is this necessary? This is completely something that should have been left on the cutting room floor. I don't get it. I just don't see why that was necessary. Use a narrator. Save some time, save some money. Beyond that, the actual meat of the movie itself, it's disjointed. It jumps around from scene to scene very quickly. Sometimes we don't have a chance to appreciate an action scene because it so quickly moves on to the next one. In my opinion, if you look at a great action movie or a great summer blockbuster movie, it should have one action scene near the beginning, one action scene in the middle, and then a big one at the end. And then the rest of the time should be filled up with either things that move the plot or the characters along, or maybe little action scenes that barely qualify. There are exceptions to this rule, movie like 300, for example, but for the most part, I think you have to keep that balance, and this movie has no sense of balance. It just kind of keeps chugging along from one scene to the next, and I don't feel that sense of balance was there. There are things in this movie that just don't make any sense, and it really makes me feel like that Jerry Bruckheimer and Gore Verbinski, because of all their, I guess you could call it, hubris or whatever, they just kind of feel like, I want this in my movie. It's going in my movie. I don't care if it's stupid or if it makes sense. There's a scene in this movie where a bunch of rabbits are following the characters around, and this isn't a spoiler because it doesn't matter to the rest of the movie at all, which is one reason why I bring it up. The rabbits suddenly turn feral and start cannibalizing each other. Not to say they start killing each other. Actually, it's one of Tonto throws the rabbits a piece of rabbit meat, and they all of a sudden grow fangs and start eating it. And I was watching that thinking, what is the explanation of that? And then they kind of explain it, and the explanation doesn't really make that much sense, and they never come back to it again in this movie. They refer to it, and then it's just over. Why did that have to be in the movie? Why did we have to watch rabbits with fangs ripping apart another rabbit for 15 seconds? Why did that have to be there? It's just like, he really wanted killer rabbits in this movie, so let's just put it in there. The female lead of this movie, I think her actress's name is Ruth Wilson, is really boring and really makes you miss the female leads of the Pirates movies, because those were much better, and it's not that those were spectacular, but she gets a lot of screen time and she's not interesting. Johnny Depp playing the same role over and over, playing these crazy characters without, it's like, he's stuck in that whole Jack Sparrow thing. He needs to go back to making smaller, independent movies, in my opinion. And, I want to refer back to that whole thing I said about this movie being really silly with that framing device and some other scenes in this film. There are other scenes in this film that are very adult. I mean, this movie is rated PG-13, and it pushes that. If this movie had a little more violence in it, we would be talking about an R rating. I really do. I mean, I'm not going to spoil. This is not a spoiler because it was in promotional material, but there's a character in this movie that rips out a person's heart and eats the heart. They don't show that in the movie, of course, but it's said that that's what happened. And, you know, he's a very menacing villain, which is obviously fine for a PG-13 movie like this even, but we're still talking about a movie that has a lot of deaths, a lot of shooting, a lot of shootouts, a lot of, you know, violence, a lot of fights, and, you know, I mean, when you take all that and you put it together with something that can occasionally be as silly and juvenile as this Lone Ranger movie, I just feel like you have this. It's like they couldn't quite get it balanced, and I don't know what the target of this movie is, and that's why it's going to be such a huge box office bomb. It already is a giant box office bomb, but yeah, so I'm a little disappointed because I was hoping this movie would subvert the problems of the last 2, 3 Pirates movies, but didn't happen. Just kind of a convoluted mess. You know, like there's this. I'll give you an example. You know, there's a scene, and it's actually right at the beginning, and then they show it again near the end, where a couple of characters break into a bank, and that lasts about, you know, 30 seconds, and then they just move on, and, you know, what it ends up being a fairly important scene to moving the plot along, and they just, like, you know, get it over with fast as possible. You may have seen the other female character in this movie, whose name escapes me. She's the chick from, you know, Fight Club. She played Marla in Fight Club. I can't remember her name. She's in a lot of movies by Tim Burton. She played Bellatrix in Harry Potter. Whatever her name was. She's a fairly significant actor. She's in this movie for literally like 7 or 8 minutes. She has 2 scenes. One of them takes only a couple minutes. I'm like, did they put her in this movie and then just forget to make her do anything really significant at all? I mean, she's in and out so quickly. It's like they didn't plan this out very well. So yeah, that's my Lone Ranger review. Scale of 1 to 100, I'll give it a 29. Well below average, definitely bad. Not completely horrendous or anything. It's not as bad as a movie like, you know, I'm not going to say it's as bad as a movie like Alone in the Dark or The Love Guru, but it's quite bad. And that's my review. Next movie will be probably Pacific Rim. I'll be seeing that one next week, probably. Might see White House Down before then, I don't know. See you later.